So this is what he meant. It's quite obvious now, but at the time, I missed it. We were so close. We walked together, talked together, ate, laughed, and cried together. So close. And yet, I never quite got it. Until today, when I stared at the place where his body no longer lay.
He is risen. 3 small words that brought the collective pace of humanity to an absolute standstill. He is risen. 3 words that shattered prisons, words that shook the earth's foundations, words that transformed a sense of utter despair into cries of pure joy and ecstasy. History's greatest triumph that still shape our reality. Even today, we are assaulted by constant distraction, countless sources waging war on our intention, yet 3 words pierce the noise. In our hunger for validation, our desperate pleas for love and attention, 3 words calm our anxieties. In a universe spinning at breakneck speed, its inhabitants locked in an existential crisis, 3 words proclaim the purpose of our existence. He is risen. Lay hold of this truth and embrace the peace within. Yesterday, fear reigned in our hearts. Yesterday, we sat in crippling darkness. Yesterday, we suffered abuse and all the accusations of a broken world. But today, our King, our healer, our defender is risen. And this reality doesn't merely accompany us on a meaningless journey. This changes everything. For you see, if he is risen, then all other pursuits become secondary. All of our failures become insignificant. All criticisms and condemnations become irrelevant. There is only his word, his mission, and his infinite, unconditional love for you. There is nothing that Jesus cannot overcome. We know this because he lives. We know this because he is risen.
So it is Resurrection Sunday. You heard it announced by Danae right at the very start of the service. This beautiful voice cutting through, announcing resurrection to us. What? You say, I don't remember that at the beginning of the service. That's because you were late. And you don't want to be late on Resurrection Sunday because the stone's already rolled away by the time you get there, and you don't want to miss a Sunday like this. But it is, in fact, Resurrection Sunday. He is risen. We sing it, we announce it, we call it. And this week kind of takes us on this journey. It's a strange thing that we get part of, actually, as Christians on this journey, isn't it? Because we know where the story is going to end, but we begin it every year and we tell our way through this story. So even in the dark moment of Good Friday, we still know that Sunday is coming and everything's going to be okay. But this week, to me, seemed to be a little bit different from some of the other weeks that we might have encountered over time, because this week, a whole host of things started to happen in the very same week. You may or may not have noticed this. There was an election on Tuesday. And it's interesting to me to note that as this election sort of happened, I start paying attention to what's being said, to what's going on. And now I need to confess this right at the very start, okay? I'm British, right? So I don't have anything to vote in this particular election, okay? But I need to be very clear because transparency is important. And my politic is essentially, my job in North America is to bring you back to the Queen. Now, to be fair, we're a little busy with your southern neighbors at the moment. Make America Great Britain again. But politics have been on our table this particular week. And I'm trying to pay attention and I'm trying to listen because I want to understand the journey of our province. And so I listened to Jason Kenney's speech as he accepted this position that the province has elected him to. And right at the very end of his speech, you may have heard him say this: the idea of Alberta will animate our new government. So here we are in a week leading to resurrection, and a week where we as a church are going to talk about resurrection, and he talks about animating our new government. Quite literally, we will bring it to life. Now, some of you are in the room going, well, I didn't realize it was dead. And some of you are thinking, yes, finally. And we can find ourselves divided on this, but it struck me as fascinating that this is the language we use in Resurrection Week, that we would bring something to life. And then also, of course, this week, we found ourselves staring at these dreadful images as this 850-year-old Gothic cathedral in France burst into flames. Notre Dame was engulfed to the point that apparently it was only minutes away from being totally destroyed. And this is a strange thing for some of us. Maybe you've been to this cathedral. Maybe you, like me, have stood in it. And on one hand, it's just a building, right? And there are many buildings in the world. But in the other sense, there is something sacred about this space. And when you stand in this building and you feel something of what's going on in its hallways, you resonate with it. And when we see an image like this, it kind of shocks us at some level. It speaks to something of the mortality that we all find ourselves living in. And in the midst of this, very shortly, in fact, the fires were almost not even properly out. The French president, Emmanuel Macron, texts out on his tweet channels this message, which I'll just put on the screens for you to read just now. Macron says, "We will rebuild." And then the next day, he decides to push that a little further, and he says, "We will rebuild in 5 years." And now this is a huge challenge then for everybody, but we will rebuild it. And fascinatingly, of course, in a report just shortly afterwards, this I noticed was said, experts have put this in the threshold of realism. Like, thanks, Macron, but I don't think that's happening. Like, that's a really polite way of saying that, right? Like I'm not sure that's going to happen. So the president says we can rebuild from the rubble in 5 years. The premier says, in 4 years, we can bring this province back to life again. Language of resurrection during Resurrection Week. Of course, for me, I'm a Bible scholar, so I hear these stories going on, and I immediately find myself drawn back into different stories. One day, Jesus is with his disciples, and they're just hanging out and talking as Jesus and his disciples do. It normally goes something like this. Jesus says something, and his disciples are like, sorry, what now? Because Jesus was kind of like that. He was often talking about one thing and meaning another thing. And Jesus is stood by the temple in Jerusalem. Now, the temple in Jerusalem is this incredible sight. Herod's temple took years to build. The stones that were used to build it were unbelievable size. The disciples say to Jesus, "Have you seen the size of these buildings? Have you seen the size of these stones?" Now, what's fascinating is archaeologists tell us that the stones that were used to build the Temple of Jerusalem weren't cut or carved on the site of the temple, because it's a holy place, right? And in ancient times, the furthest thing from holy was construction workers. Is that still true? I don't know. So what they made them do is they made them cut the stones outside of the city, and then they dragged them into the city. And modern archaeologists tell us that they still don't know how they managed to do this, because we don't seem to possess technology today that could do that easily. And the disciples stand in front of this temple and they say, "Jesus, look at this." And then Jesus says, in that Jesus way, he says, "Well, you could knock this down and I would rebuild it again in 3 days." Not 4 years of animation, not a rebuilding in 5 years, but 3 days. But then John's gospel, as he tells us this story, he just throws this little helpful line into us. It says that, but the temple he had spoken of was his body. So Jesus, being Jesus, is talking about one thing, but actually talking about another thing. And in this Resurrection Week, The story that we tell is the story of this resurrection of Jesus, this story. But that's kind of hard for the disciples to make sense of because that's not what they had expected. Because if you're going to talk about resurrection Jesus, that means you're also talking about death. Because every resurrection needs a death. Something has to die for something to come back and be resurrected. And nobody expected that about Jesus. That's not on the script. You see, because if you lived in the time of Jesus, a Messiah was a kind of religious political hero. And the hope was that this character would come in and drive out our enemies, push them away from us so that we could live ourselves in freedom. And the one thing that's absolutely necessary if you're going to lead a political and religious revolution is you've got to be alive. People pick up on that sort of thing. If you're dead, you're dead. If you're dead, the political revolution is over. If you're dead, your leadership's done for. So when Jesus starts to talk about his death, nobody expects this. Nobody expects this. And then it happens. And maybe you've been in a place like this. So a group of people, they put their hope in Jesus. They put their trust in Jesus. And then they watch him die. But not just kind of like casually die, be brutally murdered and executed in front of them. And I feel like we can draw ourselves into this story and recognize this. Maybe you've had a relationship, and this relationship was formative and shaping for you, and all of your hopes was in it, and then it broke down. Or maybe you had a career, and you had this idea as to how this career was going to go, and this was making you who you were, but then the economy flipped, and all of a sudden one day you're in a meeting, and your career is finished. Or maybe the doctor called you, or maybe somebody died that was close to you. And many of us find moments in our lives where we thought we knew the story that we were part of, and then the story falls apart. Many of us can relate to this story here that the disciples were part of because it's all of our stories. That you have a hope, that you have a dream, and then it ends. And, sorry, I got a wrong picture on the screen here. Forgive me. Sometimes the technology, you know. In Mark chapter 16, the story begins like this. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Hold that thought for a second. They expect to find him dead. They are on their way to animate, not to animate anything, not to bring anything back to life. They're on their way to put spices on a corpse to stop it smelling. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, and listen to this question: who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb? But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. "Don't be alarmed," he said. "You are looking for Jesus, the Nazarene who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you into Galilee, and there you will see him just as he told you." Have you ever noticed in life how often it is that we ask the wrong question? The question appears to be a good question, and in the context, it might even be a logical question. People might gather around you and tell you that the questions that you are asking about life are correct. We're on our way to see a body. The body will probably start to decompose, so we should continue with our Jewish tradition of putting spices on it to help make that process a little less unpleasant for anybody else who might be there. But one of our major problems in this journey is, how do we get into the tomb? And this seems like the most logical thing to say. It seems like the thing that you should be saying. But it's the wrong question. It's not the question they should be asking. It's not the question they should be focused on, because the story they're part of isn't the story that they think they're part of. Jesus has changed the narrative. Somewhere along the line, the way we thought things worked aren't working that way anymore. So a very logical question like, how are we going to get into the tomb, is proved in a few sentences to be the least logical and least worthy of our attention. But that's kind of how it works sometimes in life. Your dreams die, things fall apart, and your friends and your family and your colleagues, they allow you brief, small periods of grieving. And then somebody at some point will come to you and they will say, are you kind of feeling like you're getting back to normal? Maybe you've suffered loss. Maybe you've had a relationship fail. Maybe you've lost someone close to you. Maybe you've recovered from some sort of sickness. And this strange sort of thing happens in our contemporary language where we expect normal. At some point, you're going to get back to normal. Sorry your Messiah has been crucified. Sorry that he's not going to be the liberator that you thought he was. And now we just have to get back to normal, which is spices on bodies and just dealing with that sort of everyday, regular sort of stuff. But where did we get this idea that normal is what we were supposed to be looking for? Where did the idea come along that that's what we should all be aiming for? Average. Well, this is a resurrection story. Like, this story is going all sorts of wrong. If you want normal, the gospel stories are not the ones that you should be reading. There are other stories that will give you all sorts of normal, but this story is going all sorts of crazy on these girls, and they're coming up towards this tomb, and everything's about to change, and they're just trying to stick within the normal routines. Marianne Williamson, in her beautiful essay, Return to Love, which was quoted as part of Nelson Mandela's presidential acceptance speech, she says these words: we ask ourselves, who am I to be brilliant or gorgeous, talented, fabulous? Well, actually, who are you not to be? You are a child of God. Your playing small does not serve the world. There is nothing enlightened about shrinking so that other people won't feel insecure around you. We're all meant to shine as children do. We were born to make manifest the glory of God that is within us. And we can get so fixated on these mundane, everyday questions about who's going to roll away the stone when God's doing something unbelievably different just a few meters from where they're asking the wrong question. But of course, that makes us ask all sorts of other questions. Like, what if there is more to life than school, career, house, vacation, hobby, and then retire? This cycle that we find ourselves caught up in, the cycle that we're almost encouraged to live within, what if there's more to life than that? What if that way of dealing with things, what if assuming that everything comes back to normal, who said normal was right? Have we ever asked that question? Have we ever been brave enough to look at the order in which we're told to live out life and say, that's the way it's supposed to be? This is a resurrection story. Science is pretty clear that the way things work is they die and that's it over. And here we are, gathered together in a room talking about somebody who died, and that was very much not it over. So maybe all the rules are different. Maybe resurrection has turned everything upside down. But we persist. We want to live in this particular channel on this particular way. And we understand that maybe there's flaws in this, and we understand that maybe this isn't the right way to do it. But then strangely enough, when our kids come along, we tell them to do it the same way. What if it's a journey in the direction of death when resurrection calls us to a journey in the direction of life? The women arrive at the tomb, and the young man says something profound. And we read these stories so often that we kind of miss some of the profundity. He says this: he's not here. Like, duh. Like, I don't know about you, but when I walk into a room, I am instantly aware of the lack, or not aware of the lack of a dead body. Like, that sticks out. Like, I don't know how it works in Canada, but I don't walk into a room with a dead body and go, your petunias are amazing. Like, that's not how I'm wired. A dead body in a room kind of draws the attention. It kind of pulls it in, and he says, he's not here. And then he says that he's gone to Galilee. Now just put yourself in these women's shoes for a moment. You head down to the funeral home because your loved one is there. And they say, oh yeah, he's not here, he's at the mall. Like, sorry, what? Like, and this is not like, Jesus had a funny moment over a coffee and we thought he was dead, but actually he's not. Like, we saw somebody stab him. Like, he hung on a cross for hours, and they wander into a tomb with spices to cover up the smell. Maybe the best they're hoping for is, doesn't it smell as bad as I thought it was going to? But instead, there's a guy sat there in the tomb. I mean, what's he doing there? Like, this young guy just sat there like, finally a free seat. Like why is he hanging? He's hanging out in this tomb, and he makes this announcement, he's not here, which means that not only are you asking the wrong questions, you're heading in the entire wrong direction. Because if you're looking for Jesus, that means you're probably looking for a corpse, and there isn't a corpse, and Jesus isn't here because he's off in Galilee doing something else, because everything has changed. Because God's brought resurrection into this story. Albert Einstein says the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. I looked this up. Most people don't think Einstein said it, but he seems really clever, so it's helpful to put a clever name next to an idea. But there's some truth perhaps in that. How often do we keep doing the same thing? And we watch economies fail. And we watch houses not be as safe investments as we thought they were. And we watch RRSPs not hit the targets that we expected them to. And we fail to get into the university that we wanted to get into. And all of these failures happen on an almost daily basis. And yet we persist in saying that this is the story that we're supposed to live. And what if this story is us stubbornly persisting in a direction of death? When there's an empty tomb, it doesn't smell, the body isn't even there, because Jesus is doing something else, and he'd really love us to be part of it. And then there's the fact that he's not there. And that bodes some thinking about. He's not here. And just in case you're uncertain, look, not here. Well, that's some great resurrection theology for you right there. Not here. Which makes you probably want to ask another question. Where was he? And why did he need his body? So Jesus is killed as a human. He is laid in a tomb as a human. And God raises him from the dead as a human. Now that's a challenge for many of us. Because whether we are a spiritually persuaded person or not, most of the time, one of the things I notice in our contemporary dialogue is we speak relatively negatively about our bodies. We speak negatively about what it is to be human. We speak negatively about the experience of being human. And our assumption often within the core of many religious movements in the world is that God is on a journey to get you out of this body so that you can fulfill your destiny as a spiritual being. And then God messes all of that up by bringing Jesus back to life. And he takes his body with him, which means if you look closely and reflect on it closely, this is what the New Testament and the gospel is saying to us. You matter. Not just your spirit, but all of you matters to God, because all of you was made and created by him. And if you really push that and think some more, you'll start to realize that maybe that means that all of creation matters to God, that what we do here in this world matters. He is not here. He is risen. So when we often talk about faith, and we have this tagline that we use quite regularly, I'm spiritual but not religious. Which kind of means I have some leanings in spiritual spaces, but I'm not sure that actually affects much about my life. That's not the story we tell on Resurrection Sunday. On Resurrection Sunday, we reject the notion that you can divide your life up into pieces and have this spiritual bit and this physical bit. There's just you, and God is interested in all of it. God could have left Jesus' body in the tomb and done a spiritual thing, but that's not the story we're telling here. It's about an empty tomb that doesn't smell because you matter to God and this world matters to God, which, if you think some more about it, also means that what you do matters. The Bishop Tom Wright phrases it like this: the resurrection of Jesus means that the present time is shot through with great significance. What is done to the glory of God in the present is genuinely building for God's future. Acts of justice and mercy, the creation of beauty and the celebration of truth, deeds of love and the creation of communities of kindness and forgiveness. These all matter, and they matter forever. Because resurrection tells us that God is doing something in the here and in the now and in the present. So Easter pushes us towards a question. Like the experts critiquing Macron, the question is this story on the threshold of realism? Or is this story your story? Do you resonate with a story where things didn't turn out as they planned? Do you resonate with things crashing down amongst you? Do you resonate with this idea that you look sometimes at the rubble of all your hopes and dreams and think, what on earth is going on here? This is not what I thought I'd signed up for. And you ask the wrong questions, and you head in the wrong trajectory. And sometimes we find ourselves just committing passionately to doing the same thing again and again and again in the dear hope that one of these times it will work out. And resurrection on Easter Sunday asks us to think differently, that maybe God is doing something different. And in the midst of it, there's this young man hanging out in a tomb. And maybe the first time you heard this story, you naturally kind of think he's an angel, right? Because that happens in some of the gospel stories. Angels appear in different points of this story. But read it again closely. This is just a young dude. There's a guy sat there in a tomb, being chill. And the women come in, and they see him there. And I find myself looking at the story and go, what is this young man doing here? Who is he? Where does he come from? Like, what's he doing hanging out in tombs? Is that a thing now? Like, why is he there? And Mark just gives you a little tiny clue. He's wearing white. In the time and context of his day, white was what you would wear to be baptized in. White was a symbolism of new life. White meant that something new was happening. And of course, if you'd done what Mark wanted you to do, which was read his whole book, not just the resurrection story this morning, you would remember that just a couple of nights before, we've seen this person before. He only appears twice in the whole story of Mark's gospel. Once here, sitting beside where Jesus used to lay. But one moment earlier, as Jesus was in Gethsemane and he was about to be arrested and crowds came to arrest him with clubs and torches and it was all sorts of terrifying, the text tells us this, a young man. The only other time he's mentioned in this story, wearing nothing but a linen garment, was following Jesus. And when they seized him, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind. So you've seen this guy. One moment he's kind of naked. Like that's how you want to be remembered throughout history. One time in my life, my clothes fall off in a fight and it goes in the Bible. They say that what you put on the internet lasts forever. Wait, if you make it into the Bible, like, oh my goodness, you know. So this guy is in the Bible as a naked dude, right? But then we see him again. Now he's not running away in fear. Now he's not abandoning Jesus. Now he's not giving up on the crashed out, destroyed hopes and dreams. Now he's sat in new clothes, announcing that Jesus is alive and not there anymore. Can an old dead faith come alive as something new? Can a faith that you abandoned, running terrorized from a scene, can a faith where you all crashed about around you and you said you don't any longer believe in that, can that come alive on Resurrection Sunday? Can that come back to life from the dead? Like, I don't know what brings a person to church on Easter Sunday. Why did we come today of all days? Why did we not come any other day? Maybe it's because somebody said something to you. Because the strange thing about church is that it's an easy place to get hurt. It's an easy place for people to say things to you and those things not be unkind. The reason is because we're all a bit of a mess. We're all a bit broken. And when we all gather together as broken people, sometimes we bash each other up and sometimes we hurt each other. Somebody said once that I would never ever go to church because it's just full of hypocrites. And our response is, well, we're not full. But maybe your faith is a mess. And what happens, and we see this time and time again through our lives, that when the bad things happen, maybe somebody said something, maybe something happened, maybe something terrible happened in your life, and it's all fallen apart around you, and it's awful. And somewhere in that terrorist sort of moment where everything's crashing down and you feel like you're under attack, you said these words, how could there be a God if this happened to me? And you drew a line that day and you don't come back to church anymore. And then this resurrection story says, there was a young man who ran away from Jesus because it was all crashing down around him. It was all falling apart. His dreams were dying. And somewhere between the death of Jesus on Good Friday and the resurrection of Jesus on Sunday, this guy found a new faith. He didn't just polish up the old faith, but he stepped forward into something new and alive and fresh. Paul the apostle, who writes after the time of Jesus, says sometimes there's a moment in our life where we put away childish and we step into something new. And the problem for so many of us is we, like this young man, try and do childish faith for our whole life. This experience that I've got is what it's always going to be like. But Jesus didn't always work like that. And it all starts to fall apart around this guy. And he has a decision to make. Decide that first phase of his life was a waste and throw it all out, or let it be resurrected. Let it come back into something new. And for me, that's what Easter tells us. The resurrection happened. I mean, we're here as 21st century people, and we're talking about an empty tomb. But resurrection always happens. Because the story that this amazing gospel tells us is that God is trying to bring all of us back to life again. He's trying to put all of us back together again. For some of us, we're here every week because we love this story. And this story shapes us and energizes us and helps us to live it out in our day-to-day lives. For others of us, perhaps this is just this one moment of the year where we come to church on Sunday. But how do any of us ask that question? How is resurrection happening in my life today? How am I being changed by this story? Am I allowing my faith to mature, my journey to grow up a little bit? What are the things that I need to let die? What are the wrong questions that I'm asking that I need to leave behind? What is the direction that I'm traveling in that I need to turn around from? And what is it that I need to find myself in here, wherein he is risen, he is not here? You should go in a different direction. I want to pray for you this morning. So perhaps if you're comfortable, you just have to close your eyes. And as we just sit in a moment of silence, perhaps take a deep breath. And we ask ourselves the question, like, what's happened to my dreams? We ask ourselves, am I just going round and round in circles, trying to make this thing work, but maybe my direction's wrong? Or is it a moment for us, no matter where you are on this journey, whether you've been here every week, whether this is your first time, the question that the young man seems to transition through is, can you move from something which is dying into something which is alive? And Jesus, our prayer to you this morning is that we hear the invitation to move from death to life. We hear the invitation to step beyond the wrong questions, to step beyond the wrong directions, to step beyond this naive hope that if we just try hard enough, it'll all work out. And Jesus, we throw ourselves into you and say, maybe in resurrection, maybe in life that's coming out of death, you can find us, reset our lives, move us beyond normal into something incredible. It's incredible hope and love that you have called us to. Jesus, let that be our Easter question. Let that be our Easter reflection. Let it be our Easter decision. Amen.